Let me ask you a question. Are some of you perplexed, confused, spun out, spun around tonight? If you are, you're not alone. If there's one thing that characterizes our times, it is confusion, perplexity, and of course the frustration that comes with it. But what is confusion? We use terminology all the time, but we rarely take the time to think about the words we use and why. Why do you suppose that is? Let me ask you another question. Do you find yourself being pulled in a direction to use certain keywords and phrases that have been injected into the common vernacular of the business world or academic set or governmental think tank language set or whatever industry you may be a part of, or societal subculture that you may be a part of or interacted with? Do you feel a need, a pull to use certain types of language? Where does that language come from? You ever thought about that? Who injects that into the common vernacular of those areas of communication? Where did the words and their usage and their meanings come from? Do you know what their actual definitions are? Or have you heard them so many times from the press, from being online, from academia, from other people, friends, family, that you just adopted them and started using them without any thought of what they actually mean, how the words came to be, and what you're actually saying? Now, it seems like an odd talk to have, right? I mean, most people would say, well, if I've used the words, of course I know what they mean. But that's generally not always the case. In fact, particular key phrases and key words interjected into the common vernacular these days, most people actually don't know what they mean. And just because you have a large vocabulary of words does not mean you actually know how to actually use them in a contextual framework that conveys what you think it does. For example, I was screamed at one day and called everything in the book by a young lady who saw me and made an assumption about me And I wrote down all the words that she said to me: white, nationalist, white supremacist, fascist, Nazi, misogynistic, all these terms. Now keep in mind, she had never had a conversation with me, had never been around me. In fact, never even overheard a conversation. So I found it curious that this young woman was screaming at me in my face, barraging me with all these terms. So when she calmed down, I guess she had run out of her talking points, I calmly asked her, since you believe I am all these things, help me understand what they are and give me a definition for each one of them so that I can better myself as a human being. What do you think happened? She couldn't define a single one of them, and promptly got triggered and started screaming obscenities at me instead. Now, I'm pretty sure she knew what those meant. But she probably didn't know where they came from unless she watched the Netflix comedy show that tells you where those words came from and how they were used throughout history. But I did get her intent, both in her first barrage and in her second barrage of words. But she never could define the words she was trying to barrage me with, except the obscenities. And she could not explain why it was that she was screaming at me, knowing nothing about me, and knowing nothing about my life. How curious. She was unaware, cognitively, she was detached from the words she was spewing from her mouth. Her emotions were real to her, and she believed exactly what she was saying, though she had no rational reason to believe it, even though she didn't know a damn thing about what the words meant she was saying. What do you suppose was going on? Neurologically? What do you suppose was going on in terms of her emotions? That is an example of the metasphere. Unless you have meta discernment, such an event might even put you back on your heels. However, how do you know what's really going on if all you're left with is the appearances? Well, that's all this woman had to go on. Now, this gets into a deeper subject about what's happening in our culture. That type of event, that kind of usage of language without having any idea what the words mean, should tell you something. It should tell you something about what you're dealing with people. That's why I asked you. When words enter into your mind to speak, do you recognize that it's coming into your mind? Are you cognitively aware of what it is you say and do? Or are you just simply a node in a transmission network, spewing talking points somebody you don't even know wrote, injected into your head, and you're just simply rebroadcasting it? Because when I look at social media, that's pretty much what I see a great deal of, regardless of where somebody is on the political spectrum. It's funny that, in a not so funny way, and ironic, that the very people that are picking up these words and phrases and hurling them like stones at other people are also the very ones that seek to silence others that do know what they're talking about and actually can give a definition for the words they use, because they are cognitively aware of what they're doing. Why do you suppose they are that way and other people are not? So let me ask you another question. If you've got people that are hurling all these insults, accusations, and slanders, they're slandering people, using words that they don't even know what they mean. Why do you take them seriously and assume that what they're saying is true? And how do you know if you never asked them to define the words they're using and their assumptions, their accusations, and their slander? Chances are you don't and you can't, because you don't ask. And so you take things on face value. Yet, if you assume that they know what they're talking about when they don't, are you not also doing a similar thing? Are you not making a false judgment? Think about it. If you don't care whether it's true or false, or some mixture thereof, surely you wouldn't ask somebody to define what it is they mean by using certain words. And even if you did want to, you may be fearful of doing so because of the ferocity of their emotional delivery. Why do you suppose that is? You see, you live in a world where most people don't question anything. They assume almost everything from a first-person subjective point of view, based upon solely their personal experiences and their interpretation of them through the lens of their own worldview, which they were given at some point, yet never bothered to truly investigate themselves. You live in a world that shuffles words around, content around, information around, where most people have no literacy, no creative impulse to learn what words mean so that they can construct other words or construct other meanings and phrases. You live in a world where most people have very little critical thought put behind what they take in and what they spew out. And that's before you switch on the internet, one of your devices, and get on and interact. Now imagine how amplified that is. When I speak about noise in the signals, the noise floor and the information sourcing that you have is mammoth. Do you really think that you can count on algorithms to do the thinking for you when a lot of the people that actually build those algorithms think no differently than you? I mean, after all, how do you suppose the algorithms and the AI neural networks are learning? They're learning from you. And if you don't bother to look deeper at the usage of your own words and phrases, and you make faulty assumptions based upon the words, phrases, the communications of others, why would you think anything that you build would be better at it, even though it may be faster at increasing the rate of its own errors, mimicking you on a grander scale? Words matter. Context matters. If you can't discern deeper than the surface appearances which are oftentimes mixed at best with your own projections and confirmation biases, why would you suppose that the algorithms you design, the systems of artificial intelligence that you rely upon, will be able to cover you and do it for you when it learns from you? In a sense, it's just an aggregated representation of you. Now think about it. Everything that we create, everything we build, everything we communicates and imparts something of ourselves into it. Why would you think artificial intelligence and algorithms would be any different? Now imagine an AI, an artificial intelligence system that was like the young woman that I spoke of earlier. That's what you've built. And that's informing other people. So you have amplified the ignorance, the lack of cognitive awareness in your machines in a way that is creating the conditions which are now feeding back on human beings, and they're becoming transformed in a way by it. And you wonder why people are the way they are. Is it any wonder you've got so many people talking about programming and deprogramming people as if they were simply computers? They themselves don't realize that that language sounds more computer-like and machine-like than it sounds human. Here we get down to a really important thing. Awareness. Self-awareness. It is a train wreck that you've created, thinking that you can create systems that are self-aware when so many people involved in the design and build of them are injecting their own lack of awareness into them. It's always interesting to me when people want to talk to me and ask me questions about why it is I use certain types of language. Oftentimes, the people that do that probably have pretty decent intent, but many times they don't understand the language that's being used because they've never thought about it and never been taught about it. And so certain keywords and phrases trigger certain presuppositions, certain experiences, certain biases in them. And in the worst case scenarios, it triggers them to emotive negative responses, and they can't even tell you why. Because they're not self-aware. In a sense, they've become almost like automatons. They're cognitive slaves, and they don't realize it. Why do you suppose that happens? What do you think the mechanisms are that creates that? And what do you think you're really dealing with? Because human beings are not robots. Human beings make robots. Human beings were not created with artificial intelligence. Yet you have so many people that operate as though that's all they have is artificial intelligence. And why do you suppose that is? Now, do you understand why it is I ask you why it is that you use some of the words and phrases, keywords and phrases that you do? And when I see a whole bunch of those words, those keywords and key phrases appear throughout social media, why I ask who inserted them into the common vernacular? How do you know that you're not being fed by artificial intelligence? That somebody programmed that stuff in and you're simply regurgitating it out because everybody else is doing it through social pressure, peer pressure. And how do you know that you're not helping things to a giant train wreck in doing so? There's a reason why I look at the etymology of words. Because many people will give you definitions, if they give you definitions at all, that have been redefined by others, and they never questioned why they were redefined or if they were redefined out of the originally intended context. Thusly, they use those words thinking it means one thing when it may in fact mean something completely different. I see this with people who use scripture out of religious texts, oftentimes, or they're regurgitating some ideological diatribe that they learned in college from a professor somewhere who they assumed was an authority and knew what the hell they were talking about. But they never questioned it. They never did the due diligence themselves to actually look at what those words mean, why they're used, and where they came from, and what was the originally intended contextual use of those words from an etymological basis. You see, there's a reason why some people don't want other people to critically think. Because if they critically think, they might expose the fact that those who don't want them to critically think are in critical errors and don't know what the hell they're talking about or teaching them either. It all boils down to pride and fear and confusion. They're slaves. So take those ideas, those concepts, and apply that to those making life and death decisions, to leadership positions. The severity of the problem becomes all too real at that point. Now, doesn't it? You see, if you build your life on faulty foundations and you rely upon a knowledge base that you've never tested, you may find out at the worst possible moment that having not tested it, you've actually created the conditions for a very, very harsh lesson. Now, why am I telling you this? Because when you look around you, the world that you're living in is swamped by, inundated by words, phrases. And words and phrases form sentences and paragraphs. And paragraphs form chapters, white papers, books, dialogue in movies, dialogue and other content. If you just take the content in and you never stop to think about what is being told to you, you don't critically think, and you don't develop any discernment skills, you're easily deceived. And if you're building a life upon ideologies, building a worldview on which you base your decision making and your perceptions of reality upon, and you've never tested it to see whether it is valid or not, you've never done any error correcting, or you refuse to do any error correcting because you're afraid of what you might find, you're in peril.